A lot of people don't want to look back for whatever reason. I think South Africans particularly. I know that I, without even realizing, had created a barrier, a foolproof barrier, I thought, between myself and my past. But every now and again, somebody or something comes back into your life and just obliterates the barrier. In my case, it was a person. His name was Dirks. I was working in Port Elizabeth. I was 25. This was at about 1980. And one day, driving towards St. George's Park, I saw a shambling wreck coming along the sidewalk towards me, barefoot, the worst kind of hobo. His clothes were rotting and dirty, and his hair was matted and filthy. And I kind of knew who he was. And I'd met him when I was conscripted, when I went to basic training in Kimberley, where he took huge strain. I couldn't believe it, but I just had this awful feeling. There was one of disgust, a feeling of disgust and shame and resentment. And I suppose those were easy for me because below that was like a sadness, like a terrible sadness. And I carried it for days. And then I would see him around town as I was driving in the old part of Port Elizabeth. I would drive through there quite often in terms of my work. And sometimes I'd see him, shambling around, and sometimes terribly inebriated or passed out somewhere. It was almost like I kept on being reminded, And I tried as hard as I could. I couldn't switch it off. I couldn't completely deny those feelings. Many years later, I heard quite unexpectedly that he had died on the streets there. And I had that sort of overwhelming feeling again, and I had to go and do something with it. So I got in my car and I went straight home. I'd written poetry as a kid to try and express things that were otherwise difficult for me to speak about. And I wrote a piece which I called State Property, which was about experience I had with him during basic training. It wasn't cathartic, but it helped me just to actually see some of the madness and horror that I took for granted as a young person. It was an awakening for me. Something stirred in me again. Something about that, about living through that and being part of that. It stirred in me again, and I felt a certain urgency. And I had joined the off-the-wall poetry group in Observatory where I live, and with some big trepidation, read one or two of these pieces there.
Hello, how are you?
Chris was always quite reluctant to share his conscript poetry with people because it generated such fierce reactions, especially from people who didn't want to hear anything about that stuff. So I think he keeps telling the story about the first time he read State Property and one or two other ones at Off the Wall. The whole front row stood up and walked out.
We squinted into the whirling night, blinded by a formless mystery of violence. Quivering, palms sweating, a hot rock in my stomach, in the thicket, creeping slowly, chameleon-like, hand over hand, closer and closer, until I could see the ticks on your head. But I still felt something else. I felt isolated. I felt I needed to reach out to others. And so I started making contact with people that I knew were ex-conscripts like myself. And there was a time in my life in our lives, when most of us had been in the army. You could be standing around a barbecue, and 7 out of 10 of the guys there would have been through the military. So it wasn't difficult to find people to talk to. There was a reluctance amongst some. Some would say, look, I just don't want to talk about that stuff. It's way behind me. I don't want to talk about it at all. Others were a bit more curious to hear me and to chat, but tentative. And most of the early interviews that I did were kind of unsatisfactory for me. I wasn't, at the time, wasn't quite sure why, but they were very linear. Somebody would say I was born in X. My mother was this, and my father did that, and I went to school, and then I went to the army, and then I came out. A lot of these men, if you ask them what they think, you can be there for an hour and a half, and they'll keep going on and on and on. If you ask them how they felt, a second maybe. Maybe it's a shrug of a shoulder is what you're going to get. So I started reading some of my poems to them. I would start an interview and say, before we start, I'd like to read you one or two things. And I would read them, if I felt comfortable for them and for me, I'd read them State Property. Or I'd read Aftermath. There are a couple of poems that I would read. And then 7 out of 10 times they would engage and they would say, oh, that reminds me of this. Or, you know, what happened is, oh, I haven't thought about this for a long time. Or, God, you know, that's brought this up for me, you know. Or else, in a minority case, they'd say, I've got nothing more to tell you. Thanks for sharing that with me, but, you know, cool. So I got quite an expensive dictaphone, and I would record some of the interviews, but I'd also make notes. I would type them up, and in most cases I would take extracts from the interviews that I typed up and present them as what's called found poetry, which is poetry of everyday speech, and those had a profound influence on people, because as I went along I found that I wasn't at all looking for war stories. I was trying to engage in a conversation about our military experience as young people from a distance, from the ages, because most of the people I interviewed were between 55 and 68. Some things were said that made us realize that our militarization, what we did and how we behaved in civilian life afterwards, in the intervening years, affected our partners, affected people who worked with us or for us, and affected our children. Whether you became a driver or a cook or a scribe or an electrician, as a conscript, everybody did basic training. And that basic training was not the so-called initiation that white boys were supposed to have. It was destructive. It was very destructive in many cases.
The government spends a huge amount of money training these guys for 2 years to become lethal weapons. And it shuts them down emotionally, makes them obedient, very disciplined, very demanding, quite perfectionist, and quite violent. And then they go home and become fathers.
A memory steeped in the chemicals and images and secretions running the gamut of intensity between fear and sorrow and
People
sad.
said, no, you've got to do something with this. You've got to take this poetry that you've written and read and the interviews and so on that you've done. And Tariq and Maura said, yeah, we've just got to go, let's work together. And so we started meeting on Valentine's Day in 2017. I'd met Tariq in Observatory, and he was a great Shakespearean orator. That's fantastic Shakespeare. And he coached me to read this socially constructed silence, conscription poetry. And then he got into it.
We did workshop a couple of his poems earlier on. I mean, 10 years ago was the first time I heard State Property. And that was a piece of work that struck me as an iconic South African piece, a piece that deals with the immediate trauma and the transgenerational trauma that can be generated from the particular moment that's been described in that poem.
His jowls probably shook. They usually did when he closed in, pronouncing a litany of hate and annihilation. You are state property, dokes. You and all your maatjies. Nobody's gonna give a fuck if you die.
As a piece of writing that he was engaging in from his own experience, there was something very visceral about it, extremely painful about it. Painful, I think, both for the performer and the onlooker. And I guess that's exactly the kind of work that I'm interested in.
And then Maura, as a woman, I'd never really thought about how other people experienced me and my milieu and her experience of having been married to an infantryman, a parabat, and her discussions of that just convinced us to get together and get this thing going.
I know myself to be, like many other people, especially conscripts, to be quite emotionally shut down. And it's quite difficult to penetrate that and to actually really connect with it. So the repeated practices and performances, and I don't know, something happens when you perform poetry. It connects with your feelings so much more than when you're just reading it to yourself.
Which had devoured and digested our parents, siblings, and peers to construct around and about, and especially in our hearts.
That's very good. Again?
Repeating.
Again?
Repeating.
We avoided what?
Intimacy.
Yeah, did we avoid hamburger and chips?
No,
what did we
intimacy.
avoid?
Intimacy.
Okay, by?
By repeating. I don't want to talk about it.
Okay, so you're repeating it. What are you repeating?
I don't want to talk
You don't-
about it.
again.
I don't want to talk about
What
it.
did you say?
Talk.
I can't hear you.
Talk.
What did you say?
Talk.
You don't want to what?
Talk.
Say that again.
Talk.
You don't want to?
Talk.
Say I don't want to talk.
I don't want to talk about
You
it.
do what?
I don't want to talk about
I don't
it.
believe you. What?
I don't want to talk about
I'm
it.
not listening. Say
I
it again.
don't want to talk about
Again?
it. I don't want to talk about it.
Okay.
We just give our poor Airbnb guests.
The other element that really was powerful for me, especially with looking at the found poetry and Chris's poetry that looks at the aftermath. You know, how did that experience affect them and their lives thereafter? That became one of the core drawing points for me.
And they marched mortars steadily across dead white ground, probing for us, like fishermen working the shallows with tridents, prodding for souls.
There was this awkward point at rehearsal, and I could see that something was sitting on Chris's heart. And he kind of came out with it and said, what the fuck are you doing working with me on this piece, with this material, And I said to him, I said, brother, this is my history. This is my history too.
It was just, wow. It was something just inside me just said, this is the right thing to do. It's a risk to present poetry to any audience, particularly poetry of this nature. The audience can be hostile or even particularly worse if they're disinterested. I get nervous, I get anxious, and because this project is so important to me, I am concerned that it will ultimately be dismissed. But I do it anyway because there's a story that's been hidden that I feel needs to be offered to people.
Have you ever had a memory colonize a piece of you? Colonize a large country in the territory of your soul? 1, 2, 3, 1.
We will not fear the horses and chariots of our enemies. Be it that they are more than us, for the Lord our God is with us. I am so deaf. Press your thumb down like so.
Unity is strength.
All get up together, come back, suck for tunda.
You O's have got 15 minutes to get to your temporary base. After that, anything moves is history, man.
That we were present when in our minds we were so far, far away. We pretended to be here, but we lived in our heads.
Dokes dropped his rifle. It clattered onto the bricks. Such was the silence that shut down. I knew nobody else was breathing either. I switched off my eyes so that no light could betray my presence. And I felt nothing for him. We felt nothing for him. It was better that way. With neither piper nor marching band leading us, we returned and settled like silt in family and church and government again.
I didn't have any idea how closely and intensely they would not only engage with the material, with the presentation, but the thoughts and comments and questions that came up was very gratifying, I must say. It felt really good.
There's a much deeper, unspoken history of violence in South Africa, which has affected us hugely, has affected people, in my opinion, hugely, and affects us today. And as Marie said, you know, it's all around us. It's here. It's affecting us and will carry on affecting us until we possibly have some of these very difficult conversations.
Performances like this that has a lot of knowledge about the different types of pain felt by different types of people, that's very informative, and those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And I think that it's essential that everyone should be interested in talks like this and performances like this. So thank you for being brave and handing us a lot of information like this. And let's face it, our generation is more on not getting facts and information at a one-dimensional version. So doing it in a poetic and artistic medium allowed us to connect with it and learn from it on a much deeper level than just your textbook research. Yeah. So thank you for that.
As South Africans, we operate from degrees of trauma. Trauma is something that no South African can escape from. And the denial of it or the running away from it is only going to exacerbate the problem. And I think Chris's work is a direct confrontation of this trauma. It's diving into it in a particular kind of way that's there when an individual has to almost wade through this pain with a deep sort of objective of trying to get to a particular kernel of truth, not necessarily for catharsis, but for the fact that we need to know. And that desire to need to know is something that I share very deeply with this work with Chris.
The one good thing about, valuable thing about the conscript story and this poetry is it shows all that conditioning so vividly, so brings it to reality, makes it obvious, makes something that was hidden obvious, and makes it very clear there's a lot of work that needs to be done to actually, before we'll actually ever get to the point where we can be all happy together and able to have constructive dialogues with one another.
The thing that drives me the most is that Dirks did not live in vain, that his experience and what happened to him doesn't just disappear. It's very important to me because there are more Dirkses out there, a lot of Dirkses out there. Some men who are ex-conscripts are now willing to engage and talk about their experiences. I think as men have gotten older, they're more willing to talk. They just need the forum. They just need an opportunity. It's important for me to share as many of these stories as I can.